Hello, everybody. Speaking as an audience member, we're thrilled that you're here. And I think all four of us are thrilled to be here with you tonight. And I wanted to start off the discussion with a kind of lightning round because it's been almost 2 years since we published our Weinstein story and since the Me Too movement, founded by Tarana Burke all those years ago, became a global phenomenon. And I want to ask you two questions to sort of set the table for the discussion. Can each of you quickly name something concrete, something real that has actually changed in the last almost 2 years, not just a social attitude, not just a way of thinking, but a law, a policy, something that's really affected people's lives? And can you name the concrete thing you most want to change? If you could pass a magic wand and pass a law or create a policy or flip a switch, what would that thing be? Fatima, let's start with you.
So there have been concrete wins. We've had over 10 states pass new laws in different parts of the country. Some states passed new laws last year and this year, covering more workers, changing the way companies have to deal with non-disclosure agreements, getting at some of the smaller things that have been long-standing practices that allowed harassment and abuse to thrive. And just in April, Maryland passed an amazing new law, just as one example. So there have been concrete wins that are exciting. And there have been concrete times where workers have joined together and bonded together to raise problems of harassment using litigation, having a major communications campaign, and they're not alone. So when the McDonald's workers went out with their charges of harassment across the country, they were joined by Time's Up, they were funded by Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, and women across this country working in all these sectors aligned themselves with McDonald's workers. It was the first strike in 100 years around harassment. So that's new. And McDonald's inspired the Google walkout, and the Google walkout inspires the FBI trainees. And so we are seeing people respond. So that all of those things are concrete and are gonna drive change. I'm always pushing for more. And so I actually, when I'm seeing these states pass new laws, and I'm super excited about it, I think one problem we have is that states, some of them think we have to do one thing, and we need them to take on about 10 intractable problems at the same time. So they need to deal with transparency, they need to make our laws better, they need to cover more workers, and you can walk and chew gum on it. So that's what I want to see with a different level of urgency.
Okay, great. How about you, Aidan?
Well, what came to mind for me was that very concretely, women voted, ran for office, and won in unprecedented numbers. And this was one of the issues that really animated that civic engagement. And it's really transformed what's possible. Not enough has happened yet, but something very concrete is Ayanna Pressley, one of the freshman members of Congress, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, is one of the champions of the Be Heard Act, along with Representative Clark and Senator Patty Murray,
Yes.
right? The Be Heard Act is the most comprehensive overhaul of our anti-discrimination and harassment in the workplace protections since 1964, basically. It would totally transform the protections and remedies available to millions of women throughout our workforce. So that would be a game changer. It has been introduced, right, in both houses, and it is a real thing that lives in the world. Now, the one thing I would wish for is that it would actually pass and become law. So onward to that.
Okay, great. How about you, Mira?
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I was going to bring up the Be Heard Act too, but you've done it, so that's great. I'm sorry, things are a little delayed today because I'm literally just in from Albany. We were up in Albany with Time's Up today, trying to get the Albany legislature to pass a few bills regarding statute of limitations for second and third degree rape, and removing, much like a law that we passed in California last year, the one grope law, basically getting rid of the severe or pervasive bar to be met for sexual harassment charges. And a few other things dealing with worker safety and sexual harassment, and it went much longer than we thought. We were talking to individual assembly people, and I think it was a successful visit, but it was very, very intense and very long going. So we raced down here, and here we are. But that alone is a change that we saw Governor Cuomo really champion the ideals of this movement, trying to take on the problems faced by women and workers and men, because obviously, as you know, sexual misconduct doesn't just affect women, it affects everyone. Women disproportionately, but men, non-binary people, every religion, every race, every age, everyone is at risk. But I think it's an incredibly positive time, and as I said, in California, we passed several laws last year, and I worked very closely with a group called Equal Rights Advocates there, and we had a group of laws that fell under the category #TakeTheLead. And we passed 5 of the bills through the California legislature, and we got Governor Brown to sign 3 of them. So we got to do away with the sneaky inclusion of non-disparagement agreements, and they were basically, each of the bills included a number of things. One of them also included mandatory education for all businesses operating in California for their employees, and the bar was set at 5 employees, not 50. And it used to be 50, and then it was only mandatory for supervisors, and those are usually the problem, the problem group anyway. The ones in power are the ones who tend to wield that power unfairly. We did do the one grope rule, which was fantastic. We have something called the Hollywood law, and you can see its application if you look at Ashley Judd's court case, because the judge has ruled that, unfortunately, the Hollywood rule is not retroactive. The lawyers who created it, the lawmakers who wrote it, would say they're misinterpreting it, because basically it sought to clarify the existing California law that said that sexual harassment doesn't just have to be from your boss to the employee. It can be a number of people with whom you have a business relationship. And in my business, that could include a producer, a director, a studio head, a casting director, an agent, a financier, an investor. But it also works for the gig economy, for people who have irregular business relationships that are fluid and changing and could be parallel business partners rather than one person having a kind of financial authority over the other. But we see how very important that law is, because if it had existed in full effect before Ashley's charges were relevant, then the judge wouldn't have been able to throw out that part of her court case. So these laws have immediate effect. So now anyone who says, well, it wasn't my direct boss, but it was, I went to, like a Shark Tank situation, I went to this big investor, I brought my patent, and they agreed to finance it, but then wanted to have a relationship with me. That is sexual harassment now under the very well-defined law, and we did that. So that's really exciting. So there is progress. We have a ways to go on statute of limitations in a lot of places. You know, today we were fighting for second and third degree rape to have no statute, as first degree in New York has no statute. And right now, New York is one of the worst states on statute of limitations for second and third. The worst is North Dakota with 3 years. New York is 5. It's parallel with Alabama, which I'm not sure is really a badge of pride these days. And, you know, basically we're pushing for that to change, because rape is rape, whether it was a violent, you know, traditionally imagined rape, whether it was performed through incapacitation or, you know, the mental incapability of a person to give consent, or just without consent. It's still rape. It's still going to haunt these people the rest of their lives, and people should have more than 5 years to bring it forward and bring their perpetrator to justice.
Okay, great.
What I wish for.
So we're counting that as the thing you most want to pass right now.
The thing well, I really want to see that statute situation pass. And so I was super candid today in a way that made me very uncomfortable afterwards. And I've been reeling from that all day because and you'll read in page 6 what I'm talking about. And I don't really want to go into it today here, but I was super self-revelatory, and that's what sometimes I have been doing over the past 2 years, and that has been a hard trip for me, honestly. It's not really fun, and I keep telling myself I'm going to stop revealing stuff about myself, but then today I felt like in the service of this law passing, I had to be a bit more, well, that one applies to me. Rape 2 applies to me, and I'm going to tell you why people don't come forward. You know, and in the past I've talked about a violent sexual assault I suffered as a teenager, and I did come forward and nothing came of it. But the Rape 2 situation had a very different feeling as a victim, came with a lot of shame and a lot of me wanting to cover it up. And so we talked about that today, and I tried to impress upon people there, you know, when people say, oh, you had 5 years, why don't you come forward? You know, it would be so easy, what's wrong with you? And I was like, you don't understand. I'm only coming out today with this, like after 20-something years of keeping this inside of myself, and I'm only doing it because I feel that there's a higher cause that we could, you know, achieve with that. So that's really big to me, and also focusing on from primary through college level curricula to help change the culture so we're not just doing triage, but we're raising young people who no longer engage in this kind of behavior.
Well, speaking of young people, I think we should bring some of that backstage conversation to this stage. One of the things we've been looking at is what's going on in schools, which is very confusing because essentially a whole round of behavior that was accepted for far too long, bra snapping, patting girls' butts in the hallways, has now been reclassified under kind of a Me Too harassment label by schools. And it's on the whole, our sense is that it's being taken much more seriously. But then the looming question is, how do you actually address this behavior, and what should the punishments be, given that some of these boys are 15 years old? You know, given that this is a school environment, which may be different, and given that these behaviors have gone unaddressed for far too long. So will you repeat a little bit of what you were saying backstage about the tool? You were talking about the tools that we currently lack for addressing this behavior and what you think we need to develop.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of, unfortunately, of girls in particular experiencing harassment and sometimes violence at school, it's not a new idea. And Title IX, the law that applies to schools, we brought the case 20 years ago that established that schools had an obligation to address harassment, right? So this isn't a new obligation. And at the same time, over and over again, schools got very used to doing nothing in response to harassment. And one of the things that both Me Too going viral did, and I think college student activists also did, was remind schools in a very serious way, actually, you have to do something. And so we're in this weird situation where now schools are feeling a different sort of pressure, including from parents in the school who've been saying Me Too, who are saying, I don't want the same for my daughters. And you have some schools that have overreacted, who've done nothing for decades, but have overreacted. And what they need is more information and guidance and a bigger set of tools. You know, we have schools across this country who adopt zero tolerance policies for all sorts of things. You know, you wear the wrong color t-shirt or you forget your uniform, and that's enough to get you suspended from school. So you're used to a zero tolerance approach that makes no sense in a whole bunch of situations.
Do you even like the phrase zero tolerance?
Oh, I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think, you know, if we go back to why we started it.
Because the question is zero tolerance for what?
But
right?
so here's the problem. A school, I think it's ridiculous because it doesn't allow for nuance. A school should be able to say, and I would argue must say, that they will not accept harassment and violence in their school. So maybe that's zero tolerance, that you can't engage in harassment. But the consequences for engaging in harassment are not singular. It is not a one-size-fits-all, because harassment happens on a continuum, and so the consequences should happen on a continuum as well. And the problem is, rather than having that kind of hard conversation, right? You know, it is a hard conversation to talk about what are the real tools. Instead, we have a Department of Education who has put out a Title IX rule that would make it hard for people to come forward at all. So, you know, if I had a magic wand, right, and we're going back to the magic wand, I would have a Department of Education that was really focused on creating an additional toolbox for schools so that they were able to really look at, you know, low-level things and think about how do you create the culture that allows for difference. You never want to be in a situation where you're having to tell young people, young girls, you know, it is okay if somebody's patting your ass in the hallway. That's just a thing because boys will be boys. That's not the answer. They should be okay with coming forward and saying, I don't like that. I want it to stop. And the question is, what does a school do to drive different behavior?
So I want to ask about the Weinstein trial, which is currently scheduled to start in September. I mean, Megan and I are certainly watching it very closely. And just maybe to set the table, I guess what I'd describe as being very significant about the trial is that there's an ocean of complaints and accusations and allegations against Harvey Weinstein. It's vast. It's 80 plus women have come forward publicly. This trial addresses a very small subset of that. It's based on the experiences of 2 women. And so it feels like it is going to be a very fraught time. And it feels like potentially some of the original, a lot of those intense, strong feelings that came out of the Weinstein story are going to be revisited. And I'd like to hear I don't think any of us can really predict what's going to happen in the courtroom, but tell us what you think it may mean. Tell us what you think the cultural, the social significance may mean, and what you think it will feel like as a moment for women.
I mean, I have to say that we can't rely on whatever the outcome is inside of that courtroom to be the only indicator of where we have gone and moved as a country, and so I hope that people don't do that. But so many people have given us the gift of their stories over the last year and a half. You know, Mira, thank you. But that is really tough to do that again and again in order to not just move culture, but also to seek real justice. And we have been waiting for a concrete moment around this individual. So my expectation is no matter the outcome inside of the courtroom, it will be the beginning of more and deeper conversation about what it means to actually hold people accountable for violence in this country, and also what it means for survivors to begin to heal.
Jen, how about you?
I mean, I think that one of the things that characterizes this moment for women in general, but also among survivors, is just the ways in which there's been an insistence on showing up for each other and supporting each other across industry, across community, and from the very beginning in terms of how Tarana Burke has framed the history of her movement and putting young women of color at the center, to the Golden Globes action, to the many ways that women have been organizing together and for one another. And that has enabled us to shape policy in an inclusive way. It has enabled us to also support each other around our specific industry needs and interventions that are possible. And it's also enabled us to start a different kind of cultural conversation that is really inclusive and uplifts creates the space for many, many more stories. And so I'm hoping that whatever happens inside the courtroom, to Fatima's point, is the organizing of women and the activism and the courage really of women outside the courtroom is just going to keep opening up the space for more stories that are the least visible, and more solutions that allow us to make real concrete progress to our first question and there is so much more that is possible now. It's really a question of us continuing to move and build together in this way.
Mira, maybe it's appropriate and fitting that you're going last because, of course, you were in the first wave of women to publicly describe their experiences with Weinstein, and you've worked so much on these issues, so much on these issues. When you think about that trial playing out, it will play out over several weeks. The headlines will be huge. There will be a lot of attention. It's likely to be very emotional. Weinstein could take the stand. We don't know yet how many victims may take the stand. How do you anticipate it for yourself? And then how do you anticipate it for the issues that you've been working on?
Okay, well, first, let me go to like the worst case scenario, as we were, just hedging our bets here, that if it doesn't go the way that we hope it will, that I think in a sort of way, it may galvanize people further if this particular trial fails to achieve justice for the victims. I think the Brett Kavanaugh hearings galvanized people to a certain extent because we really saw a miscarriage of justice in the process. Not to say whether or not he's guilty or innocent, but that process was like a sham monkey court. It didn't resemble any of the kind of normal process by which we vet people with very important roles in our nation's life. And the fact that the FBI supposedly investigated without interviewing either of them is just all I need to know. Okay, for myself, I think I'm going to limitedly follow what's happening because honestly, just to see his face sometimes in photographs makes me a little bit ill. I was one of the lucky ones that did not get raped by Harvey, but I have friends who were raped by Harvey, and I have deep, deep fury and anger at the man for doing that to them. And I have deep anger for him for derailing my career, for retaliating against me for not having a coerced sexual relationship with him. I really want to see him do time because I feel like so far he has lost his career status, his business status, but this settlement fund that people are talking about, if it goes through, if it doesn't fail like the last one failed, that's Chubb Insurance paying his money out. That's not him. And it's such a low amount. I'm sorry, $44 million is such a low amount when the plaintiffs, when the complainants could number up to 200 people possibly. If more people come out of the woodwork, it's possible that right now the 90 or so women that we know about are only half of them that would come forward if a remedy became legally possible for them to take pretty easily.
We also don't know, I think, if there would be any admission of wrongdoing on his part.
Right. Well, just by the insurance company paying that out, there is a sort of implicit admission, but it's not him really saying mea culpa. I think he has committed grievous crimes and should suffer like any other rapist in this country. His power and his privilege and his long-term hands in all the different pies should not shield him from the way our justice system is supposed to work. So I really want to see him spending, hopefully the rest of his life in prison. So I think if that doesn't happen, it's going to be a dark day for all of us who suffered at his hands, definitely. But we ain't going to stop.
So Weinstein, who has denied all allegations of non-consensual sex, is a very, very, very particular case. But I want to ask you a little bit about broader questions about Me Too and fairness and men. There is a tremendous amount of controversy over Me Too. It's become very contentious. It's become highly debated. And one of people's critiques or fears is that it can be unfair to men in terms of what kinds of acts are actually under scrutiny, in terms of how much process there is in terms of investigating people and getting to the truth, and in terms of what kind of accountability there is. So I'd like to ask each of you, can you think of a specific example of anything that has played out in one of these cases in the last 2 years that you think has been really unfair to a man? Can you think of instances of unfairness to men?
Can I just jump in here because I'll give you guys time to think about that.
I need
I'm
time.
going to answer your question a little bit differently. The false reporting rate for sexual crimes is the same as any other crime. So to say that it is unfair to call for people to report against the people who have done something to them is like saying, don't report on the arsonist. Don't report the burglary in your home. There's the same small, under 10%, probably under 6% rate of false reporting. And yet, out of 1,000 rapes, only 7 go to trial, 6 get convictions, 5 people are serving jail time. So there's a vast injustice towards the victims of sexual misconduct. And men are also Me Too. There are so many men who've told me their stories about things that have befallen them. This is not just a women's issue. So I think to focus on the poor guy who's going to be unfairly maligned in any situation involving a criminal proceeding or a civil one, there's always the chance that it's not true. But the general rate for falsehood in this crime is the same as any other one. And let me tell you, it is really difficult to come forward and admit something like this has happened to you. So I would say that generally you should believe survivors. And I feel badly for any guy that feels that he's been, falsely accused, but I would bet that those situations are actually quite rare.
But I think we want to go beyond the criminal justice system and the kinds of really severe violent crimes you're talking about to also consider whether there was somebody who was fired too quickly without adequate scrutiny.
What about all the women who were fired too quickly because they wouldn't sleep with their boss?
Believe me, that's what we've devoted the bulk of our reporting across all of these years to. But because all 3 of you are so strongly positioned on this issue, and because we have to acknowledge how difficult this has been to resolve in the culture, I'm just curious to hear your answers to this.
Well, I agree with much of what she said, but I do think there's a couple things for us to keep in mind. And the first is that it would be a real big mistake to assume that something like having a fair and meaningful process is something that only men or only people who've been accused want. The reason that survivors often don't come forward is because there has long been, and in many places still is, a fundamentally unfair place for them to go, a place where they're absolutely not believed, where there aren't real investigations, and where nothing important happens, right, when they come forward and make a complaint. So, why subject yourself to that also unfair process? But I will say that, I'm a big believer in nuance. Some of this is complicated, and harassment takes a range of forms, from occasional comments that get under people's skin, again and again, to violent conduct that's also criminal conduct. And we're asking institutions that have been ignoring their obligations for decades and decades to suddenly get it right under real public scrutiny. And so if you told me that there were institutions making big mistakes along the way, I would believe you. I'd believe that there were employers who are getting it wrong because they have been not doing their obligations well. But I don't think that should be framed as as Me Too attacking men, or whatever the framework is. And that is because it's not only the case that men are also survivors, it's not only the case that rates of false reports are extraordinarily low. It is because that, when you're in an environment where there is harassment and violence, that's probably just one of the problems. There is an employer that has a range of work it needs to do to get better. And that is work that, in truth, will make it better for men and women and non-binary people working in a particular organization. I have been troubled, though, by the narrative that is starting to stick, frankly, that men are afraid in this moment to to be around women, to have meetings with women, to mentor. I saw a survey recently that said some extraordinary large number of men said that they were afraid to meet with women by themselves. I guess like the Mike Pence rule.
Bring mother.
But what I would say to that is we have not then done our job in explaining what harassment is, what conduct is and isn't appropriate, and reminding people that if you set up rules like I'm no longer going to meet with women, that too violates our non-discrimination laws. You can't just set up a rule that you're going to meet with men and not women, right? That's extraordinary. So change is hard. And we're in the middle of cultural change that is happening far rapidly than it usually does, right? I understand that some people are starting off and saying, what was okay yesterday is not okay today, and I find it really tough to adjust. The problem is, it actually wasn't okay yesterday. It's that people didn't talk about it, and Me Too gave us that space.
Okay, great. So we're running out of time, and we want to take audience questions, but I don't want to leave you out, Jen, and I also don't want to neglect what I think is the most important question for you, if it's okay to switch topics for a second before we go to audience questions, which is, you have such a hard mission because you're organizing domestic workers who have so little protection, women who have very little money, whose immigration status is often a question mark, who often work in very isolated environments. As the panelists already said, federal sexual harassment laws are very weak, they're very spotty, they often don't cover these women at all. So how do you maintain forward motion when it seems like you have so much stacked against you on this issue?
Well, there's just been an undeniable sense of, what's the word? It's like collective confidence that has been instilled even among domestic workers in this moment, that watching women come together and support each other the way that, and survivors courageously come forward and be supported in that process has really inspired domestic workers who are survivors as well to come forward and share their stories. And that has inspired all of us to keep pushing on solutions. One of the reasons why the Be Heard bill is so important to us is a lot of people don't realize that our federal anti-harassment protections only cover workplaces with 15 employees or more. So the entire domestic work industry is effectively excluded from any kind of federal anti-harassment protections or discrimination protections. And that has been the case forever since they were put into place. And so this is an opportunity to not only tell the story of an incredible degree of vulnerability that's occurred, but also to educate the public about the specific nature of domestic work, where you could go into any neighborhood and not know which homes are also workplaces, because it's not like there's a sign anywhere, there's no water cooler, there's no HR department, there's really just you alone in someone else's home, and the kind of vulnerability that creates and the need for solutions. We are having this conversation in the halls of power in ways that we couldn't have imagined were possible because of this movement that is not going anywhere. It's growing in power, and because survivors have really inspired each other.
Okay, great. So we in this room have a minute and 20 seconds to resolve all of these issues, but let's try to take 2 or 3 very quick questions before we tie up. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll send a microphone to wherever you are. Come on. There you go.
Oh, hi. So I have a question, which I know we talked a lot about law and legislation, and I guess my question is more about sort of how do we envision masculinity, power, privilege, and workplaces that are not only inclusive to women, but where women and men can share power. I think one of my struggles with when we talk about the Me Too movement is that we talk about men and women sort of being able to share power in the bedroom, but how much do men and women are able to share power in the boardroom and in real spaces? So I wanted to sort of hear from you about what would healthy masculinity look like, what would inclusive workspaces, and I talk about race, class, gender, and all these issues would look like, and how would that impact the Me Too movement?
Okay, so why doesn't one person take that, and we'll try to get one more question in before we have to tie up.
Well, one thing that came to mind immediately was there's a book called Broad Influence about women in leadership that was written by J. Newton Small, and she has a tipping point theory in that book where she argues that once you get to about 25 to 30% of women in decision-making roles in any institution, the culture of that institution starts to change in ways that you can't go back. And the Congress is at 24%. Nevada just became the first state where the majority of the legislature is women. So the only state that's actually reflective of our electorate is Nevada. But you could start to see mapping out, whether it's state legislatures or boardrooms, right, what it would take for every institution to get to that 25 to 30%, right? And just getting there then, what kinds of models for masculinity and men in power, right, you could start to create once there's a little bit more balance in the decision making within that institution. And I think that there's a lot of things that we lack models for, accountability, what have you, certainly masculinity, a way to be powerful in your masculinity that doesn't come at the expense of others, of women and others.
Okay, who's going to take the last question? Go ahead.
This is more a comment than a question. I just want to encourage Jodi to continue to pursue the line, not just the talented and powerful women of Hollywood and business who have either powerful husbands or fathers, but those single women, the women of multicultural backgrounds whose fathers will kick them in the ass for complaining about a man, the women who are afraid to come forward because their boyfriends or the fathers of their babies will come after them for complaining about sexual harassment at work. It is such a broader problem than just the rich and powerful and wannabe rich and powerful people. I'd love to talk to you about it, but keep pursuing that angle. The woman here who's representing domestic workers, we need people like you in restaurants, retail, construction, home health care, hospitals, nurses. We got to do more for them. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for closing us off on that note of encouragement. We take your instructions very, very seriously. And I think that we have to give up the stage, but really thank you so much for this discussion, and we look forward to so much more.